Hello everyone, welcome to Module 1 of Zero to Permit. In Module 1, we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of an air permit. And like I said previously, we're going to talk about this in a manner that's simple and follows the 5W approach. The who, the what, the when, the where, and the why when it comes to air permits. Permitting can be complicated, but it's a necessary part of doing business within the state, and more specifically within the counties of Los Angeles, Orange County, parts of San Bernardino, mainly because that's where the AQMD operates, or the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Now, even though permits are complicated, there is a method to the madness, and we're going to share that with you throughout this entire seminar, and we've already touched upon a little bit about this method in the last module. And so in Module 1, we want to drill all the way down and start with the basics, or some foundational knowledge about air permits. And we're going to do that so that you have a good understanding of why air permits are needed in the first place. And like I said, we're going to do that by answering 5 basic questions about permits or air permits. Who needs to get an air permit? What is an air permit? When is an air permit needed? Where do you go to get an air permit? And lastly, why are air permits needed? And so let's start with the first W, or who needs to get an air permit. Within the AQMD, any person, businesses included, with a piece of equipment that can emit air contaminants generally needs a permit under Rule 201. Now, there are exemptions to the permitting requirements, and these exemptions are found in Rule 219. Now, moving on to the second part, let's now talk about what is an air permit. Because like we just said, any person or business with a piece of equipment that can emit air contaminants needs an air permit. And so that's a good place to start. So now let's talk about what is an air permit. An air permit is a written or legal authorization issued by a regulatory agency, and in this case it's the AQMD, that authorizes the holder of the permit to either construct or operate a piece of equipment that emits air contaminants. Now again, the important part here is that a permit is a legal document, and this legal document gives you the formal authority to operate or construct the equipment within the restrictions or conditions of the permit itself. Now, the permit is issued at the conclusion of a review process of the equipment being permitted, and so the process goes something like this. If you want to get a permit for your piece of equipment, you first submit a permit application. The application is reviewed, and at the end of the review process, the permit is issued. When the permit is issued, it's issued because the AQMD has made a determination that the piece of equipment can operate in compliance with all the applicable rules and regulations pertaining to it. Now, these regulations pertain to the construction of the equipment as well as the operation of this piece of equipment. Now, a permit will have a description on the face, and this description will be very specific as it will describe the piece of equipment, and it will also list the address of where this piece of equipment is located. Now, the important thing to note here is that permits are issued to a single piece of equipment at a single location having a single owner. And so if any of that changes, actually the permit becomes null and void, and that's very important to understand. In addition, a permit will also have conditions that will limit its operation. Again, a permit is issued by the AQMD when they have determined that the equipment can operate or be constructed in compliance with all of the rules and regulations. It's sort of the culmination of a review process, or the permit or the issuance of the permit is a culmination of the review process which leads up to the issuance of the permit. Now, moving on to the third W, when is a permit needed? Now, a permit is needed in 2 cases. Number 1, to build, erect, install, alter, replace any equipment that can emit air contaminants. Or number 2, to operate any piece of equipment that emits air contaminants. Now, we touched upon this briefly in the first W, but there's actually a 3-step process for determining the permit applicability, or when does a piece of equipment need a permit. It's actually like a 3.5-step process. We'll go through it now. The first step is to review Rule 201 to see if the equipment is subject to permitting. When you do this, you'll find that pretty much anything that combusts fuel is going to be subject to Rule 201 and thus would need a permit. However, when you move on to the second step is to review Rule 219. And reviewing 219 is important because the rule will tell you if this piece of equipment is exempt from permitting. And so the important thing to note here is that a piece of equipment can be subject to permitting under Rule 201, but at the same time it can be exempt from permitting under Rule 219. And so you want to be able to interpret both rules properly. And what we find is that interpreting Rule 219 carefully is key when trying to stay out of trouble when it comes to permitting. Now, we said it was a 3.5-step process, so what is the half step? Or what is the step 2.5? The step 2.5 is actually to review the exemptions in Rule 219. Now, once you determine that a piece of equipment is exempt from 219, then you'll want to go through and look at the exemptions at the end of the rule, because Rule 219 itself is an exemption. But Rule 219 also has exemptions built into it. And so what that means is that if you have a piece of equipment that needs a permit, but is exempt from permitting, but then is yet exempt from the exemptions, then it's going to need a permit. And that's very important to understand, that Rule 219 has exemptions. A lot of people miss that, and because of that, they run into trouble. Now, the last step is you want to review Rule 222, and that's because there are some cases where a piece of equipment is exempt from permitting under Rule 219, but instead the equipment will require a registration under Rule 222. And so, again, there's the 4 or the 3.5 steps, however you want to call it, for determining whether or not a piece of equipment is subject to permitting is to, number 1, review Rule 201. Next, review Rule 219. Step 2.5 is review the exemptions in Rule 219. And then the last, or the third, or the 3.5, or the 4th step, however you want to call it, is to review Rule 222. Now, if you find that a piece of equipment is exempt from permitting, you're actually required under Rule 219T to have documentation on hand explaining the exemptions. And so it's best to create a memo to the file explaining the rationale taken to determine that this piece of equipment is exempt from permitting or it's not. Now, if the equipment needs a permit, then you want to go ahead and prepare and file a permit application that will get submitted eventually to the AQMD. And so that brings us to the 4th W. Where do you go to get a permit? This one's simple. You get a permit from the local regulatory agency responsible for air quality. Here in Southern California, that agency is the AQMD, or the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And the process to getting a permit can be generally broken down into 5 steps. Number 1, determine if a permit is needed. We just talked about that. Number 2, prepare a permit application. We're actually going to talk about how to prepare a complete permit application in Module 2. The 3rd step is to submit the permit application. That includes all of the data and the components of the permit application, the fees and the signatures, all of that. The 4th step is to answer any questions from the permit engineer as they go through and process this permit application. And then the 5th step is to simply receive your permit in the mail. Now, when you look at that, it seems like a relatively simple 5-step process, but don't let that fool you. Most people have trouble with the 2nd step. And that has become a large part of our business here at Envera Consulting, is that when you have problems with the 2nd step, then that step becomes the weakest link and the processing of the permit stops there. And so you want to be sure that your permit application is prepared correctly and it's complete. And so the last W here is, why are permits needed? Permits are needed because of a 1977 amendment to the Clean Air Act. And this amendment created the New Source Review Program, sometimes referred to as NSR. The NSR program requires sources of air pollution to undergo a review process of the project as well as the equipment prior to the construction of the equipment. And so as a whole, NSR really has two objectives. Number one, the program is designed to ensure that the emissions from this piece of equipment are as clean as possible. And then number two, it ensures that the current air quality is not degraded or further degraded by the addition of this new source of air pollution. Now in practice, the actual requirements of new source review depend on the area that your equipment is located in. So as you see here, if you're in an area that has, quote, clean air, then the permit requirements would be less stringent. On the other hand, if you're in an area that has, quote, dirty air, then the permit requirements would be more stringent. Let's just say that the area managed by the AQMD has very stringent permitting requirements. You should already know that by now. And so hence, the air here is quite dirty, quite with an asterisk. You know, it does make the list put out by the American Lung Association as being one of the most polluted areas in the US. That's Los Angeles. But you know, truth be told, the air pollution in the area has improved significantly. And regardless, there is still more work that needs to be done to clean the air up. And permitting is just one of the suite of strategies used to clean up the air in Southern California. There are a number of strategies that are in place. Permitting is just one of them. Now, because of the air here and the requirements, you know, the permitting requirements and the rules and regulations of the AQMD tend to be really stringent. And that's because the goal of the agency is to clean up the ambient air around Southern California. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy task. You know, sources must meet numerous requirements during the permitting process. And that's simply because the stringency of the air quality regulation here tends to be more than other states. Actually, at the time of this seminar in 2016, there's actually another area within the entire US that has the same air quality classification as Southern California. Southern California is the first, and the second one will be the Central Valley or the San Joaquin Valley. You know, those two areas have pretty significant air quality issues. And because of that, the rules and regulations that people must comply with, they're numerous and they're pretty stringent. You know, folks need to jump through a lot of hoops to get things permitted, but that's because the rules are designed to clean up the air in a given area. Now, when it comes to new source review and other requirements that must be met, a source must demonstrate that they will meet the requirements of new source review. And demonstrating fulfillment of the requirements is assessed during the permitting process, or more specifically, the permit review process. And so you must actually build in this analysis or this assessment to new source review when you prepare your permit. And we'll actually talk about new source review in its own lesson coming up. So you want to come back for that. So like I said, we'll talk about the requirements on the specific new source review requirements, and we'll talk about that in Module 2. Got a little ahead of myself. So with that, let's close with a little summary here. The first point is that permits are legal documents that authorize the holder to either construct or operate a piece of equipment. We've also talked about the fact that the permitting process is very complex. But permitting is necessary to do business here in Southern California and the state as a whole. We also talked about the permitting process as a whole is designed around the new source review program, which ensures that, number one, emissions from a new source of air pollution are as clean as possible. And then number two, it is designed to ensure that current air quality is not degraded by new sources of air pollution. And so with that, we'll close out Module 1, and we'll see you in Module 2, where we'll talk about the components of a permit application, as well as we'll have a little discussion about new source review. We'll see you in Module 2.